think it's on the next slide, and the immunisation handbook is our friend in working out potential catch-up schedules, and so he requires DTPA and the polio and MMR, and then that should see him through until his first year vaccinations in high school. Is there anything that you'd add to that, Vicky?
No, and as we said before, the varicella isn't required to get his benefits, but he's eligible to have that vaccine, so that it'd be optimal to give him the Priorix Tetra rather than straight Priorix.
Yeah, absolutely. So there may well be a question of parents saying, I only want what's required for the Centrelink, but I think most would be prepared to discuss saying, well, what's the recommendation, and being able to say these are actually the recommended vaccines that we would recommend, that's independent of what Centrelink require.
And our third child in this scenario is Michael, who's 12, and he's missing 1 dose of the MMR, and his mum reports that he was absent from school last month when the class received their Boostrix and their HPV vaccination. Vicky and Tim, do you want to sort of walk us through this one?
Yeah, so the so certainly he would get his catch up of the MMR dose, and then certainly parents often ask whether they should have their school vaccination that they missed in the practice, or if they'll come back to school, and it's interesting. I'm always tempted to give it if they're there and willing to have it, but Vicky, I think the public health like to give them at school sometimes. Is that right?
Well, particularly for the HPV, once it's started in general practice, then it has to continue there because we don't have the records and we don't know the dosing interval. So it'd be preferable to have the full course of HPV in the school. The Boostrix, he will be offered it again, but if you think there's a risk that he's an irregular school attender, it may well be worthwhile giving him that dose now, but just warning mum that if she's consented for it at school, she'd have to withdraw that consent, or else the nurses wouldn't know and may give him another dose.
Another dose, yeah.
Yeah, that would be an easy thing to miss, I think. And another thing is that there's the option of giving, I think I'm right in understanding, there's the option of giving MMR or the MMRV, including the varicella as well. Would that be correct?
Exactly, yes. So to get the benefits, he's required to have the MMR, but you're able to offer him a free MMRV, so that's a benefit for him to have that vaccine.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, to our participants, now that you've heard the resources that are available and the different scenarios that may be employed to institute a catch-up plan, let's run a quick poll and see how confident you are in developing a catch-up plan for a range of ages and scenarios. And the choices that you have are very confident, somewhat confident, or not confident at all. And we'll just leave this poll open for another 10 seconds or so. Okay, so Tim, you might be able to comment on the results of the poll there that you can see.
Yeah, and I think that's good that most people are very confident or somewhat confident. I must admit, I too find these the working out the catch-up regimens difficult. It's often easier sort of with the patient, but it can take time and working it out on an individual basis. Actually trying to remember it in advance to be able to draw one up, I find quite difficult. And so I think the always remember that section of the immunisation handbook and public health are also happy to help out as well.
And I'm in the lucky position in my practice where we have a practice nurse who's right on top of the immunisations, and I must admit I'll do a joint consultation with her. I'll be checking the child while she does all the paperwork.
That might
Absolutely. And I think there's a really important point that if there are quite a few people potentially coming in for vaccines because of getting Centrelink letters, that that may well be a big chunk on practice nurse time, and how that gets organised in the practice may require a discussion in practice. All practices will be different, but planning for it could make a big difference.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on. Now, following the initial consultations for catch-up vaccinations, Helen, the mum, comes back to your practice with another letter that she's received from the Department of Human Services advising that Amanda, Tyson and Michael are still not compliant with the current vaccination requirements. Now, you know this isn't correct, Vicky, so what do we do?
Well, there can still be a couple of hiccups in the process. So as I mentioned before, it's important to make sure that your practice software is communicating correctly to the register. So that's something you could check. But sometimes parents, their letters indicate that they're just missing their Medicare number registered with Centrelink. So, yeah, and parents, I think, can sometimes be a bit befuddled by government letters. So maybe just some assistance with helping parents get their details into Department of Human Services, and that's sometimes all that's needed to be done.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
We've already touched on this a little bit earlier, but we might explore it in a bit more detail, managing refusal and objections. And I guess, could you talk us through addressing some of the reasons for non-vaccination of children?
Yeah, so I think the go-to explanation is often about the vaccine refusers, because those are the people who've had most press recently, and that's a very difficult situation, and I suspect tends to cluster in certain practice areas, but it's not the most common. Many people have just aren't vaccine refusers, but get confused by the conflicting information out there, but are very willing to discuss it, and if the GP it takes their concerns seriously and addresses them, then people are very happy to have vaccines. Some people have particular health beliefs around whether a child has a snuffle or a fever and whether that's a contraindication, so it's worth being right across that. There are a few, and it was one of the questions that came through as well about whether there's a religious exemption. There aren't actually. So there's not a formal religious exemption that grants you exemption from the Centrelink requirements. Some states may allow different religious exemptions for purposes of childcare and things, but actually I don't think any of the major religions have a sort of a blanket refusal against vaccines. I think they've all pretty much said we're in favour. So it's not a common. It's not that common. And then, of course, there are practical difficulties: transport, getting to services, affording services, managing conflicting priorities of sort of school, other appointments, perhaps with Centrelink or perhaps with housing, perhaps other medical appointments, perhaps looking after relatives that can often get in the way of a non-urgent health appointment, which for many people vaccination would be.
I also find children who've spent time overseas, and there are different sort of schedules overseas compared to Australia, they often miss out.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Yeah. Just while on that, Dr. Peer has asked, is the HPV vaccine mandatory?
No. So the mandatory vaccines for the 10 to 19-year-olds are just the DTPA, polio, measles, mumps, rubella.
And while we're at it, Vicky, Dr. Canterbury asked, could you just repeat what mandatory vaccines are necessary for the payments, for the Centrelink payments under the age of 10?
Oh, under the age of 10. That's the full child schedule up to 5 years of age, up to 4 years of age, with the exception of course, Rotary.
Yep.
And depending on their age, not all doses of HIB and Pneumovax are required.
Right, okay. And we don't give Rotarix after the age of 4 months, do we, because of the increased risk of interception?
So that's very important.
Yeah.
Those age restrictions are on the different vaccines.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Yeah. And there's another question that I think is worth covering as well. There's asking about there are certainly online immunisation catch-up calculators. I know South Australia have one that's being used. What's the feeling on those?
Well, it's particularly in this kind of setting where we've got older children, it's not going to be accurate, and so we'd really refer people to the handbook, particularly for the under 10s, and then that one-page blue schedule that we've demonstrated before. Yep. It's on our website. We've sent it out with vaccine deliveries, and that gives all the information you need for 10 to 19-year-olds.
Tim, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Going back to our 2-year-old Amanda's situation where she's had no vaccines, I know our participants from previous webinars love hearing the actual words that our colleagues use. So, say Helen came in with Amanda, no vaccinations. How would you actually open that consultation? How would you proceed with Amanda?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I'll invite everyone to think what their own answers would be as well, because I think everyone has their own script and they're often really our own form of words, and they're very helpful. My approach to that is often to say, so tell me if I think there may be concern about vaccines, tell me what you know about vaccines and what are your worries about them. And I might ask, are you happy for us to vaccinate today and go through the vaccines? If they're reluctant, if it's not a sort of a vaccine refusal or vaccine information issue, I might say, so are there particular difficulties that you've had in getting the vaccine in the past? And so invite them to sort of tell us what the difficulties are so that we can understand them. So those are the sorts of words I'd use. Are there particular difficulties that you've had in the past in getting Helen vaccinated? And what are the sorts of things you've heard about vaccines? And is there anything particular that worries you about getting vaccinated?
So, Tim, could I summarise that by saying, first of all, you'd find the level of knowledge that the mum has, and then exploring some of the barriers to instituting the catch-up program. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I tend to start by asking questions rather than telling people things. And, and I think that way, and that's always a really useful way of starting off patient education, I think.
Yeah. Vicky, we've already touched on notifying the ASA. Can you maybe just summarise or go over the different ways that we can communicate with this organisation?
Yeah, so the three main ways is Medicare Online, so that's where your medical software, best practice, or got a blank?
Best practice and medical director.
Medical director.
Yep.
Have direct connections into Medicare Online.
Yep.
Then there's a secure platform, Health Professionals Online Services, where you can put in an online request form. And of course, there are still the forms that can be written out and sent in.
Yep.
And they're available on the Commonwealth form and Commonwealth website, and they're also linking through from the New South Wales Health website. We'll show that a bit later.
Okay. Now, with the catch-up going up to 19, there are new reporting requirements, aren't there, Vicky?
Yes. So, as we've said, it's important to get those catch-up vaccines or vaccines that the child actually had earlier but haven't been reported into the register.
Yep. And parents can contact their local public health unit to get the records of what they had at school.
Well, that's important to note. So the Year 7 boostrix might count towards having enough doses of DTPA.
4 doses,
Similarly, there was a hepatitis B catch-up in high school until 2014. So that might contribute to the child being fully immunised. And we've done MMR catch-ups in high schools through New South Wales the past couple of years. So if children have participated in those programs, they may be fully vaccinated, but of course the GP won't have those records. They're held by the school program.
Right.
So the parent would then need to contact the public health unit to provide a record of vaccination, but unfortunately only the GP can submit that record to the Commonwealth. So there it is a little bit of a bureaucratic few steps there to follow through.
In some of our other webinars sponsored by New South Wales Health, we've talked about the I guess, confidentiality, and if somebody reaches the age of 14 or 15, they sort of are out of the apron straps from mum and all the rest of it. Are there any confidentiality issues that may be raised by parents accessing 15-year-olds' health
Yes,
records?
well, theoretically now the
Yeah.
14-year-old has to be asking
Yeah.
for that,
Yeah.
or having demonstrated, by being with their parent, for example, then that's implied consent.
Yeah.
But need the we'll call it a child, the
Yeah.
15-year-old's consent
Yeah.
to pass those records on for the parents to send to Medicare potentially.
Yep. Okay.
And
Go
and probably remembering what's called Gillick competency, that it's not a blanket age thing. It's based on whether the person can understand the implications of that themselves. But for most, confidentiality would be what we protect, particularly important in sort of middle to late teenagers.
Yep.
And see that it's not a blanket age thing. It's based on whether the person can understand the implications of that themselves. But for most, confidentiality would be what we protect, particularly important in sort of middle to late teenagers.
Yep.